Hi, folks. Okay, so I'm doing another live stream here in Florida on my mother's balcony because I just read that this morning Israel bombed Syria. And this is in supposed retaliation for the latest supposed alleged gas attacks by Assad on his own people. And as I've said before, this gassing their own people thing is something they dredge out all the time, whether it was Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or Assad. This is now the third time that they're saying that Assad is gassing his own people. And who is their source? None other than the infamous white helmets. And I have done a live stream about this before. My source is Max Blumenthal, who did a two-part article in Alternet about the White Helmets, in which he showed that they are not an actual humanitarian group. They are posing as a humanitarian group, but in fact they were set up by the West to help in the process of regime change. Now here's what's going on in Syria. It's always been about these three things. The first thing is that the US and the CIA has been trying to achieve regime change in Syria since the 1950s when Bashar al-Assad's father took over, because he is a nationalist who wanted to run his country for the good of the Syrian people. Can you imagine? He wanted to run the country for the good of the Syrian people, not US business interests. And the CIA has been trying to overthrow this regime ever since. So that is the first thing. The second thing is, as we found out, Qatar, which is a client state of the United States in the Arab Emirate republics, wants to ship their gas through a pipeline to Europe. And they need to go through Syria. And Bashar al-Assad said no, because basically he is working with Russia, and Russia is the current gas supplier to Europe. Europe gets about 40% of its gas from Russia, and it goes through Turkey to Europe. And also there are gas fields near Homs where Gazprom has the concession to extract the gas, and that is why Syria is allied with Russia and not the United States. And of course, we weren't having a problem with Russia until a couple of years ago when they supposedly annexed the Crimea, which was considered an aggressive move by the United States. Crimea is on the Russian border, and it's always been part of the Soviet Union before it disbanded. And then what happened in the Ukraine, which of course the United States blames on Russia for overthrowing the first guy, forget his name, was actually loyal to Putin, and he was democratically elected. And our State Department, Hillary Clinton's State Department, under the direction of neocon Victoria Nuland, engineered regime change in the Ukraine to put in a leader who was more favorable to the US, but that leader was supported by the neo-Nazis, which is why I thought Madeleine Albright's editorial in the New York Times this weekend was really rich, because she's talking about the rise of fascism, Donald Trump. Are we going to allow this to happen? Are we going to allow these democracies in Europe to go fascist? And here we are the ones creating the conditions for the democracies in Europe to go fascist. Because what's happening is, with increased globalization and automation and robotization and artificial intelligence, there is not a place for someone who does not have very advanced education. And so there's a lot of natives, whether they're white Americans or white Europeans, who are feeling threatened by the onslaught of immigrants from other countries. And a lot of the immigrants into Europe are coming from the colonialism that we have established in Africa and the destabilization that we have caused in the Middle East, causing migrants to try to flee to Europe. And in our case, in the US, migrants are coming from Latin America because we've destabilized a lot of those countries too. And I had great high hopes for some of the more socialist governments down there, Lula in Brazil and Ecuador and Bolivia, and we now see that a lot of those governments are turning towards the United States as well. And the trumped-up charges that they just created to put Lula in jail so that he could not run for re-election because he's extremely popular, they deposed him in a coup, was pretty outrageous. But getting back to Syria, so what happened was the U.S. wisely stayed out of that civil war, which was basically caused by, well, actually, and I want to have Ashley Smith on my show, who's a socialist. He writes in Vermont. And he was talking about there is real reason to have reform in that country. I am not saying that Assad is a saint. You know, he does take political prisoners. There are a lot of civil liberties that I'm sure they're lacking, but let's face it, they have free health care, they have free education, they have a lot of social programs for the people, and in many cases in these countries, sometimes civil liberties are sacrificed. I know that was the case in Cuba, but when I went down to Cuba, I found that they have far greater democracy than we have, even though they're a one-party state, because they have elections on the local level, the provincial level, and the national level, and they are not corrupted by corporations who buy the politicians. So, you know, you could define democracy as a lot of things, but in my mind, I think it's the people having a say in their government. And ironically, I think in the one-party communist state of Cuba, the people have more say in their government than we do here in the United States. But getting back to Syria, and I'm sorry I keep digressing, but it's just my stream of consciousness way of thinking. So we were not getting involved in Syria until 2013, when supposedly that was the first time that Assad gassed his own people, and it was later shown with the great investigative reporting of Cy Hirsch. I'm reading his book now called The Dark Side of Camelot about John Kennedy's administration. But Cy Hirsch showed that it was not Assad who gassed his own people. And last year, about a year ago, when Trump bombed the Syrian airfield, it was also shown by Theodore Postal that Saddam did not gas his own people, that it was more likely a pipe bomb that was exploded on the ground. But Trump retaliated because it was in the beginning of the deep state, our military-industrial intelligence complex backed by Wall Street and their stenographers in the mainstream corporate media, basically saying that Trump was colluding with Russia and Putin to influence the election. So they somewhat backed him into a corner, and he did those airstrikes. Now we have the latest supposed gassing of his own people in Duma this past Saturday, and the only people who are saying that this happened was the White Helmets, who is the phony, supposedly humanitarian organization that Netflix did a propaganda documentary on, and they won the Right Livelihood Award, which is kind of like the Nobel Peace Prize, when in fact the reporting of Max Blumenthal, as I was saying, exposed them to be a part of the Al-Nusra Front, which is the group that we decided to support, even though we didn't want to get into Syria prior to 2014 because we didn't know who the good guys were. We called the Al-Nusra Front terrorists because they were an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, and yet they were the ones that we started supporting, and then all of a sudden we didn't call them terrorists anymore, we called them moderate rebels. So Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett have done a lot of great reporting on this, and I did a live stream about this back in October of 2016, what's going on in Syria, so I don't want to get into that whole live stream, but the bottom line is the White Helmets are not what they appear to be, and yet they are using this latest bombing. I think that Israel, it was just reported in the BBC, that Israel is behind the bombing of the airstrip where 14 people were killed in Syria. Now, they did not accept responsibility for it, but they have accepted responsibilities for other bombings since 2012, and the U.S. did not do it. And I think that this was directly responsive to Trump defying the deep state last week and tweeting that we were going to get out of Syria. So now, of course, that this supposed gas attack happened by Assad, he is tweeting just the opposite. And he is so easily manipulated, it's really sad, because any good instincts that he may have about being non-interventionist are being totally overpowered by the deep state and all of his generals who are advising him, and the mainstream media. And this article by Madeleine Albright, I just thought, like I said, that was rich, considering she was one of the most neocon, warmongering secretaries of state we've had in recent history. And for her to talk about Trump being a fascist and Trump being a threat to democracies around the world is just ridiculous. So I think we have to remain ever vigilant about how we are being manipulated. Unfortunately, the press, the First Amendment, freedom of the press, was so that the press could be what they call the fourth estate and speak truth to power. But unfortunately, in this case, the press is not speaking truth to power. The press is providing propaganda for power. So we have to keep reading our independent journalists. I like to read people who are actually in the country, like Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett, who actually went to Syria, who went to Aleppo to report, and not sitting in safe bureaus in Lebanon. Oh, and I forgot to mention the third reason that what's going on in Syria is that Syria is harboring Hezbollah, which is an organization supported by Iran. And of course, Iran is Israel's arch enemy. So anytime we have an opportunity, well, actually, Saudi Arabia and Israel and Egypt are very aligned right now. And this is really funny, because the people who say we need to keep giving $5 billion a year in aid to Israel are saying because they're threatened by their Arab neighbors, when in reality they're working with their Arab neighbors, the same countries that they used to say wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth. And they are working with their Arab neighbors who are Sunnis, who have their own opposition to Iran, because Iran is Shia. So it's a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's what's going on with Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States. And I just hope Russia did not retaliate for this Israeli attack, because I think right now Russia is being very cautious. And what's ironic is Russia is the only one with Syria trying to get rid of ISIS in the country. And they've almost completed that process. So what's happening right now is, instead of supporting what our so-called goal is to fight ISIS, if we really wanted to fight ISIS, we would be supporting the government of Syria and Russia, who are actually getting rid of ISIS. But instead, we are stirring up trouble there because of Israel, because of Iran, because of the deep state, a whole bunch of reasons. But the bottom line is, it's not what they're telling us it is. So keep reading your independent media and keep fighting.